Hi, Scott.
Hello, Mark.
Welcome to episode 20. Can you believe
What
it?
a milestone.
There we go. There we go. And I know it's a bit of a cliche to say this is an important episode, but for me personally, my career has all been about starting the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. How can we find a drug to make a difference for these kids and save lives? And today's topic really is how pricing and access influence the drug pipeline. And so, such a critical topic.
Yeah, it really is an important topic, Mark. And we've got two great guests with us today who've been on the front line of drug development and are in position to help us better understand some of these potential risks. First, we have Aaron Mistry. Aaron is the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer of Formedics, and Imran Nasrallah. Imran is the former U.S. head of BD&L at Bayer and now founder at Snap Life Sciences. So welcome, both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Well, we're thrilled you're here, both of you. And let's just jump in, if we could. Aaron, I'm the one here who's never worked for a manufacturer, so I'm going to be the sort of the lowest common denominator here. Help me and help our listeners understand really how does the whole process of innovation happen? Can you give us a quick overview and sort of bring us up to speed?
Sure, happy to, Mark. I think there's a number of ways that innovation happens. It's a complex process, as we all know, that involves various stages of research, development, commercialization to bring new drugs and treatments to the market. There's R&D, which often begins with extensive research. You've got collaboration and partnerships where biopharma companies often collaborate with academic institutions, research organizations, and other industry partners to advance the cutting edge technologies, expertise, and use the resources, right? And then you have, venture capital gets involved, helps bring those products, whether they come out of a university or wherever they're coming from, into the marketplace and start to run clinical trials. They put a significant amount of funding efforts behind the clinical trial development process. You've got regulatory agencies such as the FDA to play crucial roles in fostering that innovation by providing guidelines, incentives, expedited pathways, for example, the orphan drug designation, priority review types of products, development for treatments of rare diseases and unmet medical needs. And then you've got the patients, right? And increasingly, biopharma companies are adopting a patient-centric approach to innovation, involving them in the drug development process, understanding their needs, tailoring treatments to individual characteristics, which is precision medicine. So that it's moving a long way. I think the point of this podcast is probably to talk a little bit more about innovation and the market dynamics, right? Those pressures, the competition, evolving healthcare trends that influence innovation. And certainly the risk taking, right? These investment companies, companies must be willing to take certain calculated risks. They've always taken risks, right? Venture capital and other funding mechanisms have always taken risks on the clinical side of the business. What's been unclear and less clear for them as they move forward has been on the potential commercial viability of that product. A lot of policies are changing. And as time goes on, they continue to change and they continue to have a massive effect on innovation, which we'll get into in this podcast. And that's been the biggest question right now of how do we manage outside of the clinical risks? How do we manage that potential on the market risks? And that's a lot of what's happening with the IRA and a lot of questions that are coming out of it. So that's a little bit of an overview of how innovation happens, and there's obviously very much a lot of details that go behind all of that.
Great. Imran, is there anything you want to add? Or maybe you could also share, because you could also share from your roles, what time period do you look at, as you're thinking about innovation and drug development?
So, I traditionally, I think when you look at innovation, if you go all the way back, I guess, to the Bayh-Dole Act and the Federal Technology Transfer Act, where a lot of the government funding for research really got transferred out of government labs and into university labs. The intent behind this was really about how do you then commercialize these innovations and get them into the market. And so it used to be a fairly linear chain where you had federal dollars going into federal research labs, also into universities. And from there, as Aaron kind of outlined, it would then transfer from the university into biotech companies. And then as, value is being created, you're buying and selling assets between biotech companies and ultimately to big pharma. What has changed, I think, from that model, I think, is really one from a linear change to one that's more of a network. And Mark, you said that you were at the CF Foundation, and I think one of the things that the CF Foundation did that was very innovative in terms of drug development was to actually put their own dollars, venture philanthropy, into the development of a CF drug through Vertex, right? That was a highly innovative model, and it was actually a new entrant into the innovation ecosystem, right? So it wasn't just straight from the federal government to the university to the biotech companies and on and on. It was, you had patients being involved in this by virtue of the Disease Foundation. I think we're at a point now where to get a successful drug into the market really requires these types of networks or stakeholders that are in the ecosystem. And so, because everyone has a different interest and a different reason for seeing a drug get into the market. You have a lot of different stakeholders. Now you have disease foundations, their venture philanthropy arms. You have, obviously universities. You have incubators. You have, traditional biotech and pharma. The VC world has also kind of gone through changes. So there's this entire evolution that's going on the innovation space that really, I think, requires a new way of thinking about how do you get drugs to the market, and then thinking down far end where Aaron plays, in that commercial aspect. How do you then think about what are the right business models for getting these innovations out the door and paying for them, and again, awarding success to those people that took the risk to bring these new medications to the marketplace.
Imran, just to follow up on that, how do those two domains intersect? The on the one hand, thinking about the science and what could be a good product clinically, as Aaron was saying, and then on the other hand, the commercial opportunity and whether it exists, whether it's meaningful, whether it will provide a return for the investors. We hear about the connection of those things, but lots of times we don't really fully understand it.
Yeah, I think, that's something that's a story that's really worth telling, I think, in the public sphere, right? Because I think that, politicians, they try to put this thing out there that, you have the government and academia on the one side and industry on the other, and industry basically takes without giving. And the truth of the matter is that the two are actually are dependent on each other. So industry relies on the government and it relies on the universities for biological research, right? I mean, a company can't be an expert in everything. So the public, the taxpayer does fund the NIH, which does do public research, and it also funds research in academia, which is necessary to understand the foundational biology around a disease space. Where that kind of transition occurs is really in translational medicine, right? So how do you move out of, cell lines and model systems into animals, but more critically, how do you move from an animal into a human, right? And that juncture really is where I think industry, and as we just talked about, the disease foundations really kind of come into play in that translational space. Because foundations, for example, they provide access to KOLs, they provide access to patients. Foundations very oftentimes have patient registries, they have biorepositories so you can do phase 0 studies, right? So there's a lot of these tools that exist on the innovation space on the early stage side, and where pharma and biotech kind of step in with that translational space is then to say, how do we now move it into the human, right? And so then to filing the IND and getting into clinical trials. But that space is where that transition occurs, and there's a lot of collaboration that goes on between these two different entities. It is not an adversarial system the way I think politicians set it up. It is very much a cooperative network that again, involves a lot of different stakeholders.
Yeah, and so Aaron, where do the expectations about the commercialization, influence these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a great example, right? So we look at AMR, for example, antimicrobial resistance, right? It's basically when
Yep.
bacteria or viruses change over time and no longer respond to medicines. There was not a lot of innovation in that space, right? Because the returns were not there. And now
Yep.
you have an act called the Pasteur Act, right? Which is going through Congress at the moment. It's igniting that biomedical innovation, just like it would, just like we would do if it was some other type of drug. But because there was no opportunity for a commercial viable product, or limited, I'll put it that way, limited opportunity, there was no investment that was made into the anti-infective space, and very limited at best, right? The Pasteur Act would then guarantee an opportunity to basically support the appropriate use of those antimicrobials and prevent those infections, right? It's a bipartisan act. It goes all the way to supporting patients, infectious disease physicians, research communities, and then the commercialization of these types of products. And AMR is a threat to everyone, right? Our entire health system, in a way, really relies on these infection prevention type of, or infection prevention or anti-infective types of medications, and it's a threat. It's a threat to more deaths globally than HIV and malaria combined, right? So someone in the United States, for example, gets one of these infections every, I think that the data shows every 11 seconds, every 15 minutes, someone dies, which is attributed to about 35,000 deaths across the United States. And it took, who knows if it will pass, right? But it takes things like that to ignite innovation in a space. So, for example, if we continue to go down a pathway where venture capital or other types of investors don't see a return or a reward for that innovation, or a reward for the investment, I'll put it that way. They don't see a reward for their investment because these policies keep changing, and different drugs are being negotiated every 10 per year, right? We know the first 10 in 2026. Well, 2027, there's another 10. It creates a certain level of uncertainty that they're questioning, and they really want to understand what your potential market opportunity will be before they really put money into the space. And there's a lot of unknowns out there. So what does that do?
Yeah.
How do you really truly value a molecule or an asset with so many unknowns, right? There now, with AI and with technology, there's mechanistically ways that you can back into that valuation. But the NPV models that are out there don't take into consideration a lot of the things that could happen, right? From a policy perspective. And that's been very, very hard for the industry to quantify. And it's coming, right? It's coming, and it will get there. And there's certain platforms, I think, that will help with that. But the quantifiable piece of it is not there. And so when you look at the broad range of what's the true value of a molecule, it's been very hard for these people that run the models, right? Private equity, venture capital, to put the right value in there.
So say a little bit more about the role of venture capital and even BD&L for the companies in developing the pipelines.
Yeah. So, venture-backed companies often engage in licensing agreements or joint ventures, M&A to acquire novel technologies. And that's their job in here. And they have been able to, I think one of the things that they're looking at is, well, if you shorten the time frame, right, for molecules to have patent life, it doesn't really shorten the cost to the system. It just shortens the time frame. And so one of the things that they're trying to sort of figure out is, can we take a longer range look at how much value a product contributes to the society as a whole, right? To the long-term society benefit, not just the value of it while it's on the market as a brand. But what do we look at from a long tail? And there's a couple different folks that are starting to do that now. but that's really the role. I mean, venture capital really gets you through that level of funding. I mean, the government can help with basic research and those types of things, and there's mechanisms there. But the real bulk, right, of biopharma innovation is on venture capital. Um, and then the goal would then be to, either bring it all the way to the market as an individual company, and you basically live on venture capital dollars for a very, very long time. And what you're seeing is that emerging companies, there's more and more emerging companies going alone than partnering or licensing than ever before. Part of that is they've been able to acquire the talent to be able to do it, right? But also that the venture has believed in the product, but they've also carried them. So the question is, can you continue to live? How long can you really continue to live on the venture dollars? And they're seeing that time frame go longer and longer and longer. Where larger companies obviously can look at assets very, very early in preclinical and stage one and make that acquisition early, so they're paying less for the product, right? Because the MVP is not where it would be in a phase two. I think what you're seeing in the industry is a lot of companies are having loss of exclusivity issues. The pipelines aren't there to back up those pieces, and they're doing later stage asset acquisition because they have to, right? They have to support their pipeline, and they may have a lot of earlier stage deals, but they don't have a lot of the later stage deals, and that's moved over the last couple
so that
years.
brings in the BD&L aspect. Imran, you want to comment on how that works generally to augment all this?
Well, also, if you could, Imran, could you also mention how, like, the fact that there's so many that don't make it at the early stage, right? Like I think that needs to be.
Yeah.
I'd like to understand that a little bit better as well.
So maybe I could just kind of back up just a little bit and really kind of start with the premise that in life science, unfortunately, money equals science, right? And so the more money you have, the more science you can do, and the more you can kind of chase down critical experiments that then drive value inflection points for small companies, right? And the difficulty has always been for small companies is, can you get the venture dollars in that allow you to get to the critical experiments? And I'll talk about this from a BD perspective as well. But on the venture capital side, one thing that's happened over the last, I'll say 15 years, is that the venture model itself has also evolved, right? And especially in kind of more mature ecosystems like Boston and San Francisco and maybe a little bit in San Diego, is that venture capitalists have now kind of evolved into what are called these venture creation labs. And so now you have VCs that have created these closed ecosystems in and of themselves, right? So Flagship is an example, Third Rock's another, where they own their own incubation space. They have their own sets of managers that they use to kind of start up and create the company. They'll go out and they'll buy the necessary IP that they need from academia and elsewhere, and they'll accumulate all of that in-house and then spin up a company. And from a pharma perspective, when you think about what contributes to elements of cost, just the price of entry for a pharma company to get into a deal with a portfolio company that has been created in a venture creation lab becomes astounding. And I'll give you a real example. So Flagship Ventures created Metaphor, and it seeded the company with $50 million. Now, a seed round of 50 million used to be unheard of. Usually it was, like maybe $1 million max, and if you had maybe 5, that was kind of groundbreaking. We're at 10x of that these days. From the perspective of big pharma interacting with one of these portfolio companies, Novo Nordisk paid $600 million to Metaphor to access 2 development candidates for obesity, because Wegovy and these other GLP-1 inhibitors are all driving the valuations of these markets way, way high. So the knock-on effect on the business development perspective is that we have to pay those types of dollars if we want to access those kinds of drugs. I mean, it's kind of astounding when you think about over $500 million for 2 candidates that are preclinical. You don't even It's just statistically, if you take a preclinical candidate, it's what, 12% likelihood of success to the market at that point? That's a huge bet, you know? On the BD side, in big pharma, we have two choices, right? You can play with these big venture creation labs, which we all do, and so we won't pay those dollars to try to get those technologies, because again, money equals science, right? So there's a lot of science that's gone behind it. On the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of great innovative companies that come out of these ecosystems from, MIT and Harvard, et cetera. And a lot of these innovators don't have access to venture capital because the model has moved on, right? There are a few funds out there like 5AM. I think now they have a new fund called 459, which basically focuses on, early stage seeding companies. But by and large, those dollars are really kind of missing. So there is a gap in the marketplace for financing early stage companies, seed stage to Series A. And if you don't have those connections up into the VCs, you don't get access to capital. So what pharma companies are now starting to do is they're starting to spread a lot of small bets in high-risk companies. And the idea is that, for relatively few million dollars, you could probably seed, 20, 30 companies, $1 million a pop or something like that, or less. And the pharma companies are developing relationships with these companies and kind of helping them mature along the way, so that when one of these companies gets to the right point in time in value inflection, pharma's there to try to buy the company, not buy, but I'll say access the technology at a cheaper price. So BD&L within pharma has had to adjust to the way the market has evolved. We still do the traditional, traditional transactions, but it's also kind of evolved into this much more ecosystem development and working with small companies, working with the different stakeholders out there to try to help bring these companies and assets along.
Well, that's great, Imran, and I love your money equals science, and I'm going to steal that. So, actually, that was actually that was our theme on a variation on that, was when we were with the CF Foundation, because that's how we raised our money, and the bets we made included academic health centers, right? Basic research, as well as I think we were innovative. And by the way, 6-8 years before we funded Aurora Biosciences, which was bought by Vertex, we funded Genentech, we funded Genzyme, we funded these other biotech companies, and some worked and some didn't. So to your point, that to have that sort of transition, that translational research work that can be done, but you don't get a success every time.
Right.
And that leads us to, speaking of money, that leads us to sort of the point of our podcast, which is the ultimate expectation is that you're going to get a drug to the market, and in the market for a period of time, it's going to be able to get paid and compensated for all of the work that was done to get it to that point. So, Aaron, if I could turn to you, how does pricing and access and even patient affordability influence all of this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways. Certainly it's complex as well, but a lot of it has to do with, I kind of usually draw a line through these four pieces, but commercial viability or success is equivalent to market access, right? Which is equivalent to reimbursement, which is equivalent to policy. Now, there's some nuances there, but if you kind of thread the needle between those four things, the policy drives the reimbursement, right? And reimbursement is one of the biggest things that venture looks at when they fund a product, right? It's not outside of the clinical science. They say, how is the money flow in the system? Tell me about it. And it depends, right? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in our healthcare system is it really does depend. It is different in the inpatient setting of care. It is different in the outpatient setting of care. It is different in ambulatory surgery center. It is different at home. It's different based on the type of molecule you have, right? Whether that's a small molecule or a biologic. It's dependent on if you're a Medicare patient, if you're not a Medicare patient, if you're a Medicaid patient. That's part of the challenge of our healthcare system, right? Is that it is, when people say fragmented, right? It is fragmented in that way, and everybody takes different cuts. And the way that the reimbursement works is different in each of those pieces. So, for example, if you take the CAR Ts, right, which were launched a couple years ago, they were an inpatient drug. They were used in the acute care setting, which means, a standing hospital. Mass General, for example, would be one up here in Boston. The mechanism for that payment really wasn't there. So they went and they lobbied Congress and legislation to get a DRG, which is a diagnosis related group, a code essentially that helps get reimbursement. And there must be a code for reimbursement. And when you kind of start to peel back the onion of what does that actually means, it gets very complex, and do you need a new code? Do you have an existing code? How does that work with devices, which are very different than drugs?
Right.
But they actually initiated a CAR T DRG, right, which is 018. And it's specifically for those types of drugs. Normally, drugs have to roll into a larger DRG system. In addition to that, they also have an NTAP, which is a new technology add-on payment. And there's add-on payments that sit on top of bundle payments that ignite that innovation, incentivize companies to go after that. And if you can explain that to investors, which is difficult to do, and you can connect those dots, they will see that there is a pathway for that reimbursement. It's up in the air though, right? Because you don't, as policies change and things move around, what happens today may or may not be there 5 years from now. And that's what we were talking about. There's other pieces that continue to change, right? They're going through legislation, or there's models that are being run by Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. All of those things impact the ability to achieve a price and access level. And I think there's two different pieces when you talk about access. It's really coverage of the product, right? But that doesn't necessarily guarantee the payment of it. And something may be covered per se, but it doesn't necessarily get paid for. And without that specific code and mechanism to do that, that is in legislation or statutorily there, you're not guaranteed an actual payment on it. And to Imran's point, if somebody's not getting paid to use a product, it very rarely will get used. I have witnessed a number of products that have come to market, very good products, where the mechanism for the reimbursement just wasn't there. And they fought legislation, they lobbied Congress, they lobbied the coding folks to get a way to do it, find a way to do it. Unsuccessful, some successfully, but very rarely, but most unsuccessfully. And that unfortunately sets a tone, right? Sends a signal to the market that there's not a way for reimbursement to happen in this space. So why would a new drug that's being invented right now, why would they see anything different? And if you can see something different and there's a pathway to it, then that needs explained and communicated to investors very clearly.
Mm-hmm. Imran, do you want to add anything to that? What is your perspective on the role of access and pricing as it relates to the early stage decisions that you were making in your previous roles?
Yeah, so I think, Erin is definitely the expert in this space, but I think kind of how I see it impacting innovation is somewhat, I'll say, sometimes I get cognitive dissonance over this, right? And what I mean by that is, so let's say, for example, on the innovation front, right? So the federal government will want to pour all this money into innovation. Think of like the cancer moonshot, right? But then by the same token, it will sit and put in place, in effect, austerity measures on the far end, on the commercial end, such as the IRA. And so I kind of liken it to, on the one side, you're opening the faucet on your garden hose and allowing innovation to flow, and then you stick a cork on the far end of the garden hose, and you don't allow any of that innovation into the marketplace. And so from my perspective, I think the chilling effect is really that some of these policies like the IRA and I think acts that kind of inhibit new technologies from getting into the market are a disservice. I think one thing, just to pick up on what Aaron was saying with the Pasteur Act, I mean, I think that's a great example of where policy is doing the right thing, I think, for the right purposes. And I mean, I think all of us kind of probably remember hearing stories about MRSA and things like that kind of, go through the hospitals and causes all sorts of problems. But the pharma industry, by and large, would not put any investment into new antimicrobials or antivirals because the business models don't support a return on investment. So legislature has to kind of create the policies that incentivize industry to kind of do these things. So I think as long as, I think, yes, I think government tries to do the right thing sometimes for the people, but it's not thinking through the law of unintended consequences, right? How does it really impact the society? Yeah, so I'm hoping that these things like the Pasteur Act and others will kind of, stimulate innovation.
How do you, ma'am?
Sorry.
Ron, how do you think the balance is changing or not over time? It sounds like some of these things are structural and they've, been complicators for a long time, I'll say. But then it sounds also like, market access is getting tougher and, policy intervention is growing. How is the balance changing or not over time?
Yeah, so I think what's curious is that as a society, on the one hand, we definitely want the most innovative drugs, right? And that comes at a cost, right? It's expensive to create new things. On the other side of that balance equation is that we want to pay laggard prices, that we want everything to be priced at the level of a generic. And I think maybe to Erin's original point that she made at the outset is that, because the public doesn't largely understand how drug development occurs and kind of what goes into it, in the end, we will all be taking 40-year-old drugs because nobody wants to pay for anything that's innovative, right? And so on that balance equation, I'm not sure where we will end up. I think that as the country starts to institute austerity on things like drug pricing, I think it'll have a chilling effect on innovation. I think that it'll start to change where investments are made in drug development. So, for example, if you look at the IRA, it's already going after small molecules. Consider this, as all the baby boomers are now kind of entering into their, sixth, seventh, and eighth decade, neurodegenerative disorders are like, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are going to skyrocket, right? And the IRA is basically capping prices on those drugs that have big markets, especially on the small molecule side. You can't get a biologic yet to cross the blood-brain barrier, so it'll make it very difficult to kind of drive biologics to treat these brain afflictions. But on the other side of it, nobody will want to develop a small molecule to develop a treatment for, let's say, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, because it might be subject to the IRA. So we are backing ourselves into a corner on some of these disorders. The other thing is that maybe on balance, industry shifts the nature of its strategy, right? So it might decide to take a precision medicine approach to a lot of these big disorders. Take heart failure, for example. We in industry might start to look at heart failure and say that how are populations stratified? There are those who have heart failure, but ejection fraction is preserved. There are those where there is no preservation, right? And so you'll start to segment the market more and more, and you'll start developing these precision drugs that start to look more like orphan drugs, and the companies will start to then demand orphan prices, right? So I don't know if these policies that we're looking at get us out of these kind of predicaments, because I don't think they're really always well thought out. Just kind of my thoughts on this balance issue.
Yeah, thanks. Aaron, anything you would add?
I mean, yeah, I think just from a high level perspective, if you look at the industry globally and where it started from, 75 years ago, it started in Europe, right? And as I think Imran brought it up, but as austerity measures came in, the industry moved to the United States, right? What we're not seeing austerity measures, but we're seeing a much more, CMS is, for example, CMS is using their powers much more than they used to in the past. So we're starting to see that come down to industry. And so the question then becomes, where does the money continue to flow? Right? Is it China? Is it the Middle East? Is it some other place outside the United States? And our goal, right, as manufacturers, is to make sure that it stays here in this country. And so things like the IRA, right? It will be very interesting to watch over the next couple of years because it exerts pressure on all phases of the product lifestyle. The MPV calculations, as we talked about earlier, are going to continue to change. You're going to incentivize to maximize profit in a much shorter window than you did before, and that doesn't necessarily change the cost, right, or the patient out-of-pocket costs as they feel. And then manufacturers are going to try to figure out how to avoid price negotiation. But I think one very interesting thing, and I'll just make this example, is that when Medicare decided that they were going to negotiate these drugs, and there was an anti-pharma survey that was done on Medicare patients, and the majority of Medicare patients, a very high percentage, I can't remember the exact percentage, stated that they were that was a good thing, right? That they were appreciative of the government stepping in and helping to negotiate these prices, and helping to potentially lower their out-of-pocket costs, which the IRA did for that, which is great. But the negotiation of the drug prices they thought was a great thing. On the reverse side of that, there was a survey done with manufacturers, and 78, almost 80% of the companies that were interviewed in the survey are either going to cancel or delay early stage projects, majority of those projects targeting Medicare populations. And this information was surprising to the Congressional Budget Office, right? They're switching out of drug classes or indications that target that patient population. And so I think we'll talk about it, I'm sure, a little bit later, but what can we do to get the general public to realize what is happening? Because if you actually said that to a Medicare beneficiary, they would probably disagree with price negotiations. So I think there's a couple pieces that are feeding each other, but not all. It's almost like they're tangled together, and we need to untangle some of them and make it clear to the public. And I think our industry can do a better job of that.
Aaron, if I could there on that one, because let's just jump into that topic, because that's a critically important. That's where the rubber hits the road, right? And I'm gonna sort of take something we talked about earlier, which was the fact that, like Imran said, money equals science, and there is the government, there is the NIH, there are these charities, there are others that are putting money into these things, and so there's this. Is there an expectation for those initiated projects, to have a different return in the marketplace, right? I mean, how do we balance that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I know it's been talked about for a while. I think they provide very early bench science funding and research, right? And in comparison, if you look at the dollars that is being spent by these types, like the NIH, for example, if you look at the amount of dollars that are going into these investments, and then you look at the broad investment of what it takes to bring a product to market, the private industry and the money that comes from the investors is significantly more than what the government could put in. And frankly, to get a product through that development and take on that level of risk needs the private sector. And I think obviously you need bench research and you need academic institutions to do all of that. And I think all of that's very important. But that theory that we need to reap the benefits of that, but we're also not taking on a huge amount of risk is the question that needs to be answered.
Well, no, that's a great point. I think that I'm reading Tony Fauci's book, so it's all sort of top of mind right now, and I think you just sort of described it perfectly, which is that these are early stage projects. The government has been good, and in his book he does a great job talking about like his efforts around HIV. They push a lot of they're pushing a lot like industry work or whole disease work. They're not picking winners and targeting specific drugs. Those things happen much later, as you said, and it takes millions, hundreds of millions of dollars for that translational work, turn it into a product, get it into clinical trial. We worked on a drug back in the day that was actually discovered in the 1960s at the NIH, but it wasn't until a biotech company came along in the 80s and did clinical trials on it. And so I get your point. However, how do we get to a place where we can still encourage innovation while also recognizing and having a good balance between pricing and access? Maybe Imran, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aaron and I have talked about this before in the past, and I think that, and I think we both agree on the fact that fundamentally, this is really a problem of financing, right? And I think that the difficulty is that we have a one shoe fits all type of mentality, right? Or one size fits all. But the fact of the matter is that different technologies carry different risks, and with different risks, they require different ways and different business models even of financing. And we talked heavily about, Aaron mentioned, the antimicrobials. And the biggest problem with antimicrobials is the business model, right? It's like nobody wants to invest in it because these are acute syndromes that happen. And then once the treatment is over, then that's the revenue loss that happens, right? Because there's no infection. What's interesting about that is, like, can you come up with a novel business model to then try to accommodate the technology risk that goes with that type of indication? An example, I think there was a company out of the Netherlands that came up with a subscription model that they deployed throughout the US, where hospitals pay into a subscription. Whenever there's an outbreak or a flare-up of a particular infection, they will manufacture for that particular hospital and send out, right? Because that's the way infections happen. Very localized geographies. It's not a widespread thing, at least initially. And so if you can get medications to that geography to treat it, then that's how you can derive revenue from it. On the other side, you think about cancer, which is, I don't want to say that too much money's gone into it, but I would say maybe at the expense of other disorders that we neglect. So are there better business models for financing oncology research? And here in Boston, there's a professor, Andy Lowe at MIT, who's kind of came up with the idea of financing cancer research and development by issuing bonds. And so the public can participate in drug development by buying bonds that also can be sold on the market. So these are novel business models and financing mechanisms that can be introduced that are tailored to the technology at hand. Again, because each indication, each technology carries its own different type of risk that's unique to it. So I think we need to move away from kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to how you develop drugs and financing of it.
I'm going to just comment just one more thing on that point, right? Because we have talked about at length, right, Imran, what you're seeing is there's some models that are taking hold right now with we've heard about the Netflix or the warranty. The warranty models are taking a little bit more hold at the moment. It's harder to do in public, with public payers, right? Like CMS, for example, versus the private, right? And from a commercial perspective, which means the commercial patients are United, Aetna, Cigna, some of the other big ones, the Blues, and employer groups, you can do a warranty model across all of those payers, right? And it's underwritten just like an insurance company. There's third parties that are doing that now. And it's one contract across all of those private entities. And this is you, it's just like you buy a car, right? You buy a car today from a dealership and the engine goes out tomorrow, transmission goes out tomorrow. That is covered underneath that warranty, right? So you paid up front for it, and it's covered if it falls apart, essentially for a period of time. And it's exactly how the warranty models work for drugs. If you pay for a drug up front, it needs to show continued success every so often, depending on the therapeutic category or the type of drug that it is, for a period of time. And with the warranty model, if it doesn't show that, then you would be guaranteed something back by the manufacturer. And the government has done things that have, if you're involved in a value-based or outcomes-based contract, they have removed the implications of best price in that situation. And so you have seen movement there. I do think the warranty models, especially for very expensive therapies, are something that is starting to take hold, but that goes back into, and for that to happen, the best price regulations had to be changed. And so you do one thing here, other things like that have to happen, but that's financial involvement, right? That requires a significant amount of rework on the financial right. side. And CMMI is a part of the government. If you're going to go in the public realm, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation, they can do that, right? They can try different models that may or may work, or may work, and you can utilize them in a broader place. And it doesn't require the diligence and the time frame to go through regulation. It can be statutorily driven by that group, which is a big difference.
Interesting. All right, guys. Well, listen, this has really been fascinating, but we are reaching the end of our time. And Mark and I always like to get a final word from our guests on what their prescription for better access would be. So imagine you had the magic wand for the day and you were thinking about this challenge of continuing to sustain innovation for the future. What would you do?
I think Erin has the big ideas. I'm going to let her go first.
All right, Erin, we'll start with you.
That's great. I'm not sure it's a big idea, but I do think that we, as an industry, need to inspire the American public around biopharma innovation. And the reason I say that is I don't think we celebrate successes enough because we don't talk about the failures. And if we inspired the American public to get behind, we want to be the best country. We want to have the best military. We want to have the best space program. We certainly want to have the ability to have the best biomedical innovation on the market, and we are willing to pay for it, right? Can out-of-pocket costs be reduced? 100%. I think that's a big part of this. But if we inspired the American public, it would be very, very difficult for any type of policymaker, right, or stakeholder outside of that, to find ways to reduce innovation in this country, because everyone would be supportive of that, and they would not be able to collect a vote running on that. And I think someone had said it a while back, but just like we did with the NASA space program, right? We wanted, as a country, we wanted to be the first to the moon. Russia had already beat us to outer space, but we didn't want them to beat us to the moon. And the entire country got behind what NASA was doing. And if a policymaker in a particular state, or whether it's federal or local, said anything negative about the NASA program at that time in our country, they were not going to be able to stand on that. And I think we need to translate that into the biopharma industry and do we have the most direct to consumer ads. We have the ability to market directly to patients in this country. and patients are frankly supporting our healthcare. The patients are actually supporting our healthcare system. The people that have an issue with the out of pocket is typically the healthy individuals, right? But we need to get the entire country inspired. We saw pieces of that in COVID, inspired behind what this industry can do from an innovation perspective, and to keep us at the top.
Good. Imran?
I think that's pretty hard to beat. So I'm going to say I agree with Aaron. I think inspiration is huge. And I think that we need to tell a better story. And I think, as Aaron had just said, COVID is a remarkable story. We went from this global infection where nobody knew how this virus was working, what the long-term effects were, and basically within 12 months had come up with a vaccine that basically saved millions of people's lives, right? That's an amazing scientific story, and it also shows you that what the purpose of willpower can be, right? And so I will agree with Aaron. I think inspiration is huge. We can do major things if we want to, if we just get behind the right things. And we need to tell the story correctly, which I don't think we've done a good job doing.
Yeah. Yep. Good. Great point. Well, listen, thanks to both of you for joining us. It's been a terrific time. The time's passed so quickly. It
does. It flies by, doesn't it?
But as Mark said at the outset, it's an important topic, and thinking about ways that we can sustain innovation for the future. And we really appreciate your help here. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Thanks, guys. This is great.
And we get to do a wrap up. So for sort of lessons learned and other key points, Scott, you want to go or you want me to go?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. So I was struck by the simplicity. There's so much here that's so complex, right? And that's true for all of the topics that we dive into, Mark. But I was struck by the simplicity of Imran's comments that you called out earlier, that money equals science. That kind of cuts through a lot of the complexity in a very foundational way. That stood out to me. I think also, when we just started to really get into it more at the end, but it was, all right, given all these challenges, how do the financing model and the business models need to evolve over time? Because that's really what's suffering from the stress and strain of the policy and reimbursement changes that they talked about. And it sounds like there's some experimentation going on there, which is great, but it sounds like there's also room for more evolution as well. And then obviously, lastly, the call for inspiration. That's, as you always point out, Mark, that's something that we tie into here ourselves, with a goal to inspire more folks to try, new and creative ways to try to solve some of these challenges. And I think that's right on. Our industry needs more inspiration.
No,
yeah,
absolutely.
we can do a better job.
Absolutely. And we missed a chance years ago. Actually, in the 90s, I worked on a project for pharma, then called PMA, called Molecules to Miracles. And we launched it and did it, rolled it out, and it didn't get renewed. So, I wonder if we would have done that 25, 30 years ago, if that would have continued, what things would be like today. But I would just add to some of the key points, what Aaron said about coverage does not equal payment. And I don't think people understand that. You have insurance. It doesn't mean you're going to get covered. We see that all the time, like, when a natural disaster hits and all of a sudden people are like, whoa, you didn't have, hurricane coverage. Well, my home was covered. I had my house insurance. And it's very similar here, where you may have a insurance coverage, but it doesn't mean you're going to get the drugs are going to get paid for that you need. And that goes to some of the topics we've covered on other episodes, Scott, that continues to be a problem. And of course we know who picks up the burden of that is the patients. And once again, they're the ones that are subject. But I just want to wrap it up by saying that, at the end of the day, this really is all about patients. And we're not in a situation where, whether it's inspire, whether it's get people motivated, these things have real practical impact on patients' lives. And, the decisions that are made, that are being made, as they said, 70 to 80% are canceling Medicare projects. I mean, that's scary as can be, because that's going to be us,
Yep.
Scott. We're not far
Yep.
from that. And so for us, we have to do a better job. So I think that's why we have this podcast. Hopefully we're educating. Hopefully we can advocate for things, and hopefully ultimately, as Aaron and Imran said, inspire people to do a better
Yeah.
job. So that's what we're trying to do. And with that, Imran, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this as well. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much. Really
Yeah,
enjoyed
this was
it.
great. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate
And
it.
Scott, my wonderful partner, co-host, Dr. Scott Howe, thank you again for another great episode 20, and looking forward to continuing what we're doing with our podcast
Yeah,
journey.
likewise, Mark.
With that, thank you to everybody who listens. Please subscribe either through YouTube or whatever podcast you have. And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out at comments@prescriptionforbetterAccess.com. Thank you, everybody.